Relations between the United States and Russia have not always been as antagonistic as they have been since the end of the Second World War. Heck, we were allies during that war. Through much of the 19th century, relations between the United States and Russia were generally quite friendly, but it was in the 19th century that invaders from Russia took over vast swaths of the nation, threatening the American way of life in what has been described as one of the fastest invasions in history. The invasion and century-and-a-half-long war against Salsola Icali, tragus, better known as the Russian thistle, and even better known as the tumbleweed, deserves to be remembered. A March 1915 edition of the Council Bluffs, Iowa Evening Non-Peril addressed an issue raised in author Julian Street's 1914 work Abroad at Home. Mr. Julian Street, in his account of his travels across the prairies, wondered why Mark Twain didn't immortalize the tumbleweed, along with the jackass rabbit, the coyote, and the sagebrush. This is an indictment of Mr. Clemens which may stand unless we clear his record now. Mark Twain failed to mention the tumbleweed because he didn't see it. The University of Colorado Arts and Sciences magazine explains that although tumbleweeds were familiar icons of the West, they were not native to the West, nor were they grown around the early Western towns when they were established. Boulder in 1858, Abilene, Kansas in 1860, Laramie, Wyoming in the mid-1860s, Cheyenne, Wyoming in 1867, and Dodge City in 1872. To understand why Mark Twain didn't see tumbleweeds in 1861 when he embarked on his epic 3-week-long stagecoach ride across Nebraska, Colorado, Utah, and the Great American Desert, you first have to understand why tumbleweeds tumble. Tumbleweeds are noted for the way they reproduce. Reporter Douglas Main wrote in a 2014 edition of the syndicated webpage Zocalo Public Square. The term tumbleweed can refer to any one of a variety of species, like Russian thistle and kochia. Generally, these plants are bushy and round, and their stem breaks off at the ground in the fall or winter, often after a frost. One type of tumbleweed, though, remains the most notorious, the plant you've probably seen in westerns bouncing along the dusty ground. It goes by the name of Russian thistle, or Salsola tragus. Despite the common names Russian thistle or Russian cactus, the plant is neither a thistle nor a cactus, nor even closely related to either, the names being simply derived because of its thorny barbs. In his page-turning 1894 work on the subject entitled The Russian Thistle, Its History as a Weed in the United States with an account of the means available for its eradication, United States Department of Agriculture botanist Leicester Dewey described how the Russian thistle spreads. The most important mode of distribution of the Russian thistle, and the principal one furnished by nature, is the wind. In the winter, when the ground is frozen, and especially when it is covered by dry, hard snow, the weeds are driven for miles by the strong wind, scattering seeds along their track, while gusts beat them about, covering with seed all the intermediate areas, and in blizzards, driving snowstorms and sandstorms, the seeds themselves are carried to some extent independently of the plant. But, he adds, the natural means of distribution is unintentionally supplemented by other agencies supplied by man. Dewey lists many such agencies, and we'll get there in a moment, but one of these agencies took the Russian thistle where the wind alone could not. The Russian thistle is, as the name implies, not originally from these parts. Rather, Dewey writes, nearly a century and a half ago, this plant was mentioned by Linnaeus as growing in Eastern Europe, and many botanical writers have since described it among the plants of the region. The species Salsola Icali, or in some of its varieties, is found in most of the provinces of eastern Russia and western Siberia. The unintentional means of distribution to the United States occurred, Dewey writes, in 1873 or 1874. The most likely explanation is that the seeds of tumbling tumbleweeds drifted along with an order of flax seeds, imported from the then Russian Empire, although an 1896 edition of the Chicago Tribune asserts that the seeds arrived in hay and straw used in the packing of household effects of a colony of Mennonites that immigrated from Russia. In any case, the initial invasion began in the town of Scotland, in the southeastern South Dakota county of Bon Homme, although genetic testing of the weeds suggests that they were eventually multiple origins. Dewey explains that the land there is somewhat hilly and corn is the chief crop raised, so that owing to the wooded ravines and the standard corn stalks, the Russian thistle was at first slow in spreading. But the invading hordes had found a good place for their landing. Dewey writes, the variety tragus seems to have developed on the plains of southeastern Russia, where the conditions are very similar to those of the Great Plains region of the United States. While much of his work involved carefully mapping how the Russian thistle spread, he gave a simple summary. The rapidity with which the Russian thistle has spread, both in infesting new territory and in thoroughly covering that already infested, far exceeds that of any weed known, in America. Once the Russian hordes were loosed upon the American steppes, they moved quickly. The Natural History Museum of South Kensington, United Kingdom, writes that the arrival and spread of Russian thistle is considered to be one of the fastest plant invasions in the history of the United States. By 1894, Dewey wrote, one almost continuous area of 35,000 square miles has become more or less covered with the Russian thistle in the comparatively brief period of 20 years. The pace of the invasion was not just because a single tumbling weed can spread a whopping 250,000 seeds, but like a hobo drifter, they hitched a ride on the railroad. Dewey writes that there is every evidence that they are often carried to uninfested regions in the bedding or litter of stock cars. These cars are sent to the stockyards of Minneapolis, Chicago, Omaha, or Sioux City, but after unloading they are seldom cleaned at those places. They are sent instead with the litter and seeds to various shipping points, where they are cleaned if the amount of dirt or the nature of the cargo demands it. Rolling plants are sometimes blown into the trucks, under the cars, and into crevices and cordwood, machinery, etc., on flat cars, and thus are carried about the country. The website Eat the Weeds, which, yes, suggests that you eat Russian thistle, but only the tips or shoots, they offer no recipe once the plant is dried, writes of Dewey. Professor Leicester Hoxie Dewey, who worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, said in two reports, in 1893 and 1894, he knew how the plant was spreading. The trains. That might seem obvious to us, but back then it was hard work and good insight. In Illinois, he documented Salsola along railroad tracks and gave specific locations. The plant was not yet an obnoxious weed, but Dewey saw the potential problem. He recommended railroads get rid of the plant wherever they found it, and he theorized that by using the railroad and the wind, the plant could become a severe problem. But you might ask, what's the problem? Why do we care? What difference does it make? Well, Russian thistle, Dewey explains, although of some value as forage plant when young, can only be regarded as a weed. In fact, even the Russians didn't like the Russian thistle. Dewey writes that for many years it's been a destructive weed in the barley, wheat, and flax regions of southeastern Russia, and the cultivation of crops has been abandoned over large areas in some of the provinces near the Caspian Sea. No effectual methods of exterminating the weed are known in Russia. Dewey writes that it takes possession of valuable land as well as waste places to the exclusion of all other plants, and it draws from the soil a large amount of nourishment that would otherwise go to useful plants. This was a particular risk to wheat and flax. He explains that if a late spring or rather early drought checks the growth of these crops, the Russian thistle, growing as it is best in dry weather, pushes up and crowds out or starves out many of the weakened plants, and the grade of those which are left is much injured. The Lemon Grove, California Historical Society writes that a lone tumbleweed with its 24-inch root can remove 44 gallons of water from the soil, leaving vital plants like wheat to wither and die. The Ottawa, Kansas Independent Journal reported in August of 1894 that it is claimed that in the Dakotas, 1,000 square miles suffer an annual loss of 5 bushels of grain per acre due to the Russian thistle, and that Mr. Dewey estimates the damage due to the thistle in North and South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa during 1892 at $2 million. The journal expressed concern that the dreaded Russian thistle had made its appearance in Kansas. But that was not all. Dewey notes that the tumbling weeds interfere with farm machinery, and the sharp spines cause irritation and can break off under the skin, causing festering wounds in horses. He noted that on railroad grades and other embankments, these weeds choke out grass that would prevent the banks from washing out. During prairie fires, the burning thistles cause a great amount of damage by crossing fire breaks, which would otherwise be ample protection to buildings or stacks, and by destroying wooden posts or fences. The thistles bank up against wire fences, often completely covering them, and the force of the wind against the massive branches often breaks the fence down, or if fires gets into them, the posts are almost certain to be destroyed. Truly, these invaders were a menace. And to combat them, Dewey suggested all-out war. If the Russian thistles, wherever found, should be killed before they produce seed during 3 successive years, the pest would in all probability be completely exterminated, he wrote. And much of the nation heard his call. The year after Dewey's report, the state of Minnesota issued a call to arms. Joint Resolution No. 1 by the Minnesota Senate and House of Representatives read, whereas the noxious weed, commonly known as Russian thistle or Russian cactus, by its rapid spread throughout the agricultural regions of the northwestern United States, namely Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska, as shown by the Bulletin of the Department of Agriculture at Washington, and whereas it is essential to the extermination of the weed, or foresaid that the people of every infested section act in harmony, therefore be it resolved by the Senate, the House concurring, Read that the governor be requested to appoint 2 members of the legislature or other persons, as may to him states may seem fittest, to act with commissioners from other states to devise a means for concerted action in the extermination of the aforesaid Russian thistle. But Minnesota was not going to wait for those other states to act. The legislature, as a press bulletin explained, passed a law requiring those owning, occupying, or controlling lands to kill all Russian thistles growing thereon, and making it the clearly defined duties of certain officials to destroy the thistles on roads, streets, and other public lands, and to see that they are destroyed on the lands of negligent owners. The bulletin explains, the provisions are clear and the penalties strong enough so that the law can be enforced. Those other states were already in action. North Dakota passed State Bill No. 125, which read in Section 1, the noxious weed known as Russian thistle and French weed, wherever found in the state of North Dakota, is hereby declared to be a public nuisance, and is made a duty of every person or corporation owning, leasing, or having any lien on any land, regardless of the use to which the land is put, to destroy the same before it should go to seed, or if it has gone to seed, to completely destroy the same by burning it. Nebraska passed a state law. Any person or persons, company or corporations, owning or occupying any land within the state who shall knowingly permit or suffer any Russian thistle to grow or remain thereon, shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor and of maintaining a public nuisance, and shall be punished by a fine of not less than $10. But the war was already lost. The invasion was unstoppable. A tide, drifting endlessly on. So Callow writes, by that time it was already too late to halt the tumbleweed spread, and it could be found as far away as Canada and California by 1885. By 1898, the Spokane Spokesman Review was writing that the weeds were in Washington, despite efforts to combat them. The science site Earth.com writes that tumbleweeds rolled all the way across the plains in both directions, aided by railway travel and the movement of livestock. By 1885, they'd arrived in California, aided by the increasing removal of prairie grasses and the replacement with featureless agricultural fields, a process that would culminate in the disastrous Dust Bowl of the 1930s. The spread of the tumbleweed, also called the Russian thistle, is thought to have been among the most rapid biological invasions in history. By 1959, it had even arrived in Hawaii, and is currently found in all states except Florida and Alaska. What's more, Earth.com notes, from there it has made its way to countries as far-flung as Argentina, Australia, Canada, Chile, Indonesia, Mexico, New Zealand, and South Africa. All the way the tumbleweed takeover has been couched in phrases that compare it to an actual invasion. The Spokesman Review discussed war on the Russian thistle in 1898. The Lemon Grove Historical Society explained that early in 1962, some 400 anti-tumbleweed militia from Lemon Grove and Spring Valley, wearing gloves, goggles, boots, and long sleeves, and armed with pitchforks, rakes, and shovels, assembled at 8 a.m. at Mount Miguel High School and Carrington's Liquor Store, Lincoln at Imperial, then fanned out across the region to slice off tumbleweeds at the root and burn them dead. They fought on the lawn, they fought in the orchard, they fought on the street. They never surrendered. It was hunt down and obliterate the dreaded Salsola pestifera, or watch the big lemon go under. When tumbleweeds overran the town of Mobridge, South Dakota in 1989, the Night Ridder News Service reported, the invaders came in the dark, riding a rare west wind. By dawn, they had taken over the west side. Like an occupying army, they stuck together. They filled 10th Avenue, blocking access to the hospital. They surrounded town treasurer Darlene Zahn's house, trapping her inside. At 5 a.m., one of them rang John Schormer's doorbell, but when he opened it, nobody was there. Just tumbleweeds. And the problem continues. The San Diego Union-Tribune reported in 2018 that a recent tumbleweed invasion in Victorville, California, a remote city northeast of Los Angeles, best known for being on the freeway from LA to Las Vegas, has attracted national attention. In March 2024, the tumbleweed army struck again. Australia's 9 News reported that tumbleweeds have invaded a series of towns in Nevada and Utah in the western United States. The New York Times reported that in South Jordan, Utah, roads were blocked, entire cars buried. In some cases, the tumbleweed jumbles reached the roof lines, upstairs balconies of people's homes, said Richard Von Cleve, the city's public information officer. Although the Associated Press blew off the title Invasion. It's not a fiendish plan by the invasive Russian thistle to conquer the western United States. Instead, the occurrences are due to the combinations of seasonal wet and dry weather, the death cycle of the plants, and strong gusts that propel them. And if you don't like the military analogies, the Washington Post offers some other options. Some called it tumbleweed takeover. Others referred to it as Tumblemageddon. The sad fact is the Russian invasion of 1873 succeeded, and we are still paying the consequences. In 2005, researchers at Cornell University estimated that invasive species cause around $120 billion in damage in the United States each year. After 150 years of warfare, the weeds still win. There's nothing to do but laugh, a resident of South Jordan, Utah, told the Washington Post. And tumbleweeds aren't all bad. In 2021, the magazine Texas Monthly profiled people who catch them, dry them, attach lights, and sell them as chandeliers. Eat the weed suggests that you steam the shoots and season them with butter. In a more serious note, the Colorado Arts and Sciences newsletter writes that they were one of the last plants growing during the Dust Bowl, when many farmers and ranchers were unable to keep anything growing to feed cows and horses. Russian thistle hay is credited with saving the beef cattle industry, when other sources of hay disappeared. So the next time you order a hamburger or a steak, think a tumbleweed. And isn't it odd that tumbleweeds became staples in American Western movies, where they often served as symbols of the hardy American cowboy, drifting along with the tumbling tumbleweed? In a grand irony, they've become such a part of our culture that in some ways this Russian weed has come to represent the American spirit. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.